The red emergency lights of Outpost Ethelgard did not blink. They stayed a solid, bleeding crimson, casting long, jagged shadows across the grease-stained bulkheads of Deck 9. Soren Vane wiped a smear of hydraulic fluid from his forehead, leaving a dark streak across his brow. He didn't care about the mess. He cared about the hum. It was a low-frequency vibration, a ghost in the machine that shouldn't have existed. "Echo check on Sector 4, Soren muttered into his comm unit. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of a man who had forgotten the taste of water and the necessity of sleep. "Negative, Chief," came the reply from the bridge. The voice belonged to a junior tech who sounded far too caffeinated for 0300 hours. "Systems show a clean run. You're ghost hunting again." "Shut it, kid," Soren snapped, his fingers flying over the interface of his neural slate. "I don't hunt ghosts. I find leaks before they turn us into hardvac popsicles." He kicked a loose grating, the metallic clang echoing through the empty corridor. Deck 9 was the gut of the station, a labyrinth of pipes, atmospheric scrubbers, and forgotten storage crates. It was where the air tasted like recycled copper, and the silence was heavy enough to crush a man's ribs. The hum intensified. It wasn't mechanical. It felt organic, a rhythmic pulse that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. Soren adjusted his pulse caster, the weight of the sidearm a familiar comfort against his hip. He moved toward the primary ventilation shaft, his boots making no sound on the reinforced polymer flooring. 10 meters out, his neural slate flickered. The screen distorted, a wave of static washing over the blueprints of the station. "What the hell?" he hissed. He reached the vent. The atmospheric scrubber was spinning at 80% capacity, yet the air coming through the grate felt stagnant, thick with a scent he couldn't identify. Something like burnt sugar and ozone. He knelt, his knees popping with a sound that reminded him he was 34 going on 80. "Chief, your vitals are spiking," the comm unit crackled. "Commander Thorne is asking why your heart rate is hitting 140. "Tell her I'm doing cardio," Soren growled. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt and began unscrewing the ventilation cover. 1 screw, 2, 3. As the 4th screw came loose, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was an expectant silence, the kind that precedes a predator's strike. Soren pulled the grate back. Inside the dark recess of the shaft, something glowed. It was a faint, bioluminescent violet, a cluster of crystalline shards embedded directly into the station's main data trunk. "Symmetry check," Soren whispered, his hand hovering over the violet light. Suddenly, a hand, small, cool, and impossibly steady, rested on his shoulder. Soren spun around, his pulse caster drawn and aimed before his brain could even process the movement. The girl standing there didn't flinch. She was short, barely reaching his chest, with skin the color of polished bronze, and eyes that looked like they had been stolen from the heart of a nebula. She wore the simple gray tunic of the Ulani. "I would not touch that if I were you, Chief Engineer," she said. Her voice was melodic, lacking the sharp edges of human speech. "It is a resonant anchor. If you disrupt the frequency manually, your nervous system will attempt to fill the void. The result would be fatal." "Who the hell are you?" Soren demanded, his fingers still tight on the trigger. "And how did you get past the security lock on Deck 9? "I am Kirival," she replied, tilting her head exactly 5 degrees. "I did not bypass the security lock. I am an authorized personnel assigned to your quarters. I followed you here because your psychological metrics indicated a 92% probability of a self-destructive event." Soren lowered his weapon, but he didn't holster it. The Aegis badge on her tunic was real. The Ulani markings were real. The mandate, he realized, the word feeling like ash in his mouth. They actually sent one. I arrived at 0300 hours, Kirival said, her nebula eyes fixed on the violet glow in the vent. You were not in your quarters. You were here, attempting to fix a problem that is not technical, but predatory. She stepped past him, her movements fluid and devoid of the jerky hesitation that characterized human motion. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a device that looked like a silver tuning fork. She struck it against the bulkhead. A clear high note rang out, and the violet crystals in the vent shivered, their light dimming until they turned into dull gray husks. The Xylos are listening, Soren, she said, turning back to him, and they are using your exhaustion as a doorway. Soren stared at the dead crystals, then at the small woman who had just neutralized a threat he didn't even fully understand. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I don't need a shadow, Kiri, he said, his voice dropping to a low warning. I am not your shadow, she replied. I am your equilibrium. And right now, you are dangerously out of balance. She started walking back toward the lift, her oversized bag, which she had somehow been carrying the whole time without him noticing, trailing behind her on silent wheels. Come, Soren Vane, she said without looking back. You have not slept in 7 days. The data suggests that if you do not rest within the next 4 hours, your cognitive function will degrade by 60%. I cannot allow my primary subject to become useless on the first day. Soren looked at the empty ventilation shaft, then at the receding figure of the Ulani girl. The hum was gone, but the knot in his chest had only grown tighter. He holstered his pulse caster and followed her, the sound of his heavy boots echoing like a funeral march behind her silent grace. The memory of Kirival's arrival was a blur of exhaustion and irritation. For 11 months, Soren had fought the Aegis galactic bureaucracy. He had filed 3 formal appeals, 2 medical exemptions, and 1 desperate claim that his quarters were too small for another inhabitant. Every single one had been denied with the same cold, automated message. The neural symmetry mandate is a non-negotiable stability protocol for all Aegis personnel operating in high-risk sectors. He had ignored the final notification. He had ignored the assignment window. He had even ignored the direct order from Commander Thorn to clear a corner of his room for the incoming partner. But at 0300 hours, as he was staring at a diagnostic screen that made no sense, the knock had come. It wasn't a loud knock. It was precise. 3 taps, perfectly spaced. Soren had opened the door, ready to bark a refusal at whatever poor security guard had been tasked with delivering his new headache. Instead, he had found her. Humans are required to have a wife, or so your legal documents translate the term equilibrium partner. And I have been assigned to you, she had said, standing there with her massive bag and her star map eyes. My name is Kirival. I am fully certified. Soren had stared at her for a full 10 seconds. She hadn't blinked. The Ulani had a slow, deliberate way of closing their eyelids that signaled deep processing. She was doing it now, her eyes sweeping over his messy quarters, the empty coffee bulbs on the floor, and the protein bar wrappers littering his workstation. I filed a stay of execution on this, Soren had said, leaning against the doorframe. It was denied 14 days ago, she replied instantly. I have the confirmation codes if you require them. I don't want the codes. I want my privacy. Privacy is a luxury of the terrestrial bound, Kirival had said, stepping into the room without being invited. On Outpost Ethelgard, privacy is a precursor to psychological collapse. I have read your file, Soren Vane. You have the highest mission success rate in the sector and the absolute worst self-care metrics in the entire Aegis fleet. That combination is mathematically unsustainable. She had wheeled her bag to the far corner, near the environmental controls. With a flick of her wrist, she produced a folded piece of silver fabric. It looked no larger than a handkerchief, but as she shook it out, it expanded into a shimmering hammock that defied gravity, anchoring itself to the wall brackets with a soft click. "I do not use the bed," she had said, sensing his unspoken question. "Ulani sleep suspended. It allows for better circulatory regulation." "I have one rule," Soren had growled, shutting the door. "Stay out of my way." "I have one rule as well," she had countered, turning to face him. "You are not allowed to lie to me about how you are doing. Not because I am emotionally invested, but because inaccurate subject reporting corrupts the data. And the data is the only thing keeping this station from falling into the gas giant below." That had been 3 hours before the incident on Deck 9. Now, standing in the lift as it ascended back to the residential levels, Soren felt the weight of her presence like a physical pressure. She wasn't loud. She didn't smell like anything other than faint sandalwood. But she was there. "Why me?" he asked, the lift doors sliding open with a hiss. "There are plenty of other engineers who actually follow the rules." "Because you are the only one who noticed the shift in the Xylos signal before the station sensors did," Kirival said as they walked down the quiet hallway. "You thought it was a ghost. You thought it was your own mind playing tricks on you because you are tired. But you still went to look." "That's my job," Soren said. "Your job is to maintain the hardware," she corrected. "Your purpose, however, appears to be something else. You operate on a level of intuitive pattern recognition that is rare among your species. But you are burning your own candle at both ends to achieve it." They reached his quarters. Their quarters now. The room was small, a rectangular box of white polymer and functional furniture. Kirival's hammock hung in the corner like a silver spider web. "Sit," she commanded. "I'm not a dog, Kiri. You are a biological organism in need of caloric intake and REM sleep," she said, pulling a nutrient pack from her bag. "Sit." Soren sat. He was too tired to argue. He watched as she prepared the pack, her movements precise and economical. She didn't waste a single gesture. "The Xylos crystals," he said, his mind drifting back to the ventilation shaft. "How did you know they were there?" "I felt the resonance," she said, handing him the pack. It was a cold flavor in the air. "The Ulani are sensitive to the frequencies the swarm uses for infiltration. They don't attack with ships first, Soren. They attack the infrastructure. They find the man who isn't sleeping, the woman who is grieving, the technician who is angry. They plant a seed of noise in their heads, and when the target breaks, the door opens. And you think I was the target? I think you were the most efficient choice," she said, her nebula eyes softening for the first time. "You are the nervous system of this station. If you fail, Ethelgard dies." Soren took a bite of the nutrient pack. It tasted like cardboard and salt, but his body screamed for it. He looked at Kirival, who was now sitting on the floor in a cross-legged position, her data slate glowing with a soft blue light. "You're really not here to be a wife, are you?" he asked. She did the slow, Ulani blink. "The term is a linguistic shortcut for your species. It implies a level of commitment and shared survival that the Aegis found appropriate. But no, I am a researcher. You are my subject. My goal is to see if a human can find a way to live that does not involve self-immolation." "Good luck with that," Soren muttered, finishing the pack. "I do not believe in luck," she said. "I believe in variables." "And you, Soren Vane, are the most interesting variable I have ever encountered." She stood up and tapped a control on the wall. The lights dimmed to a soft amber. "Sleep," she said. "I will monitor the station feeds. If the hum returns, I will wake you." Soren lay back on his bed, the first time his head had touched the pillow in over 100 hours. He expected his mind to race, to go over the schematics of Deck 9, to worry about the xylos, to resent the girl in the corner. Instead, he felt a strange, cooling sensation at the edges of his thoughts. It was as if Kirival was projecting a field of stillness, a buffer between him and the chaos of the universe. He was asleep in 6 minutes. Kirival watched him from her corner. She pulled her slate close and made a single notation in her log. Subject: achieved sleep at 0412 hours. Possible correlation between Ulani resonance shielding and human nervous system regulation. Subject displays high levels of suppressed trauma, yet maintains functional excellence. Hypothesis: purpose is currently his only survival mechanism. Research will continue to determine if purpose can be translated into peace. Outside the station, the massive gas giant Vesper 4 turned in its slow, indifferent orbit. The stars did not care about the small humans or the Ulani huddled in their metal shells. But inside the room, for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. Soren Vane dreamed of stars that didn't burn. He dreamed of a voice that sounded like a tuning fork, singing a note that meant he didn't have to be a machine anymore. And 40,000 kilometers away, in the deep dark between the sectors, the Xylos swarm felt the signal go quiet, and they began to turn their vast, cold attention toward Outpost Ethelgard. The first day was over. There were 9 more to go, and the variables were already shifting. The first thing Soren Vane felt when he opened his eyes was a profound sense of betrayal. His body felt heavy, his mind sluggish, as if it had been submerged in a vat of cooling gel. For a man who lived on the jagged edge of sleep deprivation, this level of rest was an alien intrusion. He checked his internal clock, or tried to, but his neural link was momentarily offline, rebooting with the slow, rhythmic pulse of the station's secondary power grid. It was 412 hours, according to the small analog chronometer on his desk. He had slept for nearly 6 hours. To a normal person, that was a standard night. To a burner like Soren, it was a lifetime. He sat up too fast, his head swimming. The room was bathed in the soft amber glow of the environmental low-light cycle. In the corner, the silver hammock swayed almost imperceptibly. Kirival was not in it. "Kiri?" he rasped. His throat felt like it had been scrubbed with industrial sandpaper. "I am here, Soren Vane." Her voice drifted from the workstation. He turned his head, squinting against the dim light. She was seated at his terminal, her small, bronze-colored fingers moving with a grace that made the clunky Aegis interface look like a musical instrument. She wasn't typing. She was hovering her hands over the haptic sensors, weaving a complex tapestry of data streams that Soren had never seen before. "What are you doing to my rig?" he growled, swinging his legs off the bed. His boots hit the floor with a dull thud that felt unnecessarily loud. "I am optimizing your sensor arrays," she said without looking back. "The Xylos interference from earlier left a residue of noise in your subroutines. If I do not clean the cache now, the station's long-range scanners will start seeing ghosts every 22 minutes. Soren stood up, his joints protesting with a series of sharp cracks. He felt like a rusted machine being forced back into service. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her small frame. On the screen, a series of complex waveforms were being smoothed out, the jagged red peaks of interference turning into calm, blue lines. "That's a deep-level sweep," Soren noted, his professional curiosity momentarily overriding his irritation. Even the Level 1 techs at Central don't usually touch those protocols. Where did you learn to scrub a feed like that? Ulani training involves the study of resonance in all forms, Kiri replied, finally turning her nebula eyes toward him. Whether it is the vibration of a soul or the pulse of a silicon processor, the principles of harmony remain the same. Your rig was screaming, Soren. It was in pain. It's a machine, Kiri. It doesn't feel pain. It feels wear and tear. She did the slow, deliberate blink. You say that because you view yourself as a machine, but even machines require a period of cooling. You have reached a stable temperature for the first time in 28 days. How do you feel? I feel like I've been hit by a freight shuttle, he muttered, rubbing his face. I'm slow. My reaction time is probably down by 30%. You shouldn't have put me under that deep. Actually, your cognitive processing speed has increased by 12% since you woke, she countered, tapping a window on the screen that displayed his medical vitals. Your heart rate is 70 beats per minute. Your cortisol levels have dropped by half. You are not slow, Soren. You are simply no longer vibrating at a frequency of total collapse. Soren looked at the data. She was right, of course. He felt a clarity in his vision that hadn't been there for months. The constant, high-pitched ringing in his ears, the one he had attributed to the station's fusion core, was gone. He moved toward the small kitchenette unit in the wall and pulled out a bulb of coffee. He didn't bother with a cup. He just popped the seal and drank it black, the bitter heat stinging his throat back to life. We need to head to the mess, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. If we're going to be bird-dogging that Xylos signal on Deck 7, I need real fuel. Not that cardboard nutrient slop you gave me. I have already analyzed the mess hall schedule, Kiri said, hopping down from the chair. The morning shift change is at 700 hours. If we go now, we will encounter the maximum amount of social friction. Are you prepared for that? I've been on this rock for 2 years, Kiri. I'm the chief engineer. Friction is part of the job description. They left the quarters and stepped into the corridor. The station was beginning to wake up. The low hum of the life support systems was joined by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the hydroponic pumps. As they moved toward the lift, they passed a pair of security guards in their matte black tactical gear. The guards stopped, their eyes traveling from Soren to the small Ulani girl walking half a step behind him. Look at that, one of them whispered, his voice carrying in the narrow hallway. Vane finally got his leash. The other guard chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Hope she brought a muzzle. I heard he bit the head off a logistics tech last week. Soren didn't break stride. He kept his gaze fixed on the lift doors. He felt a sudden, sharp spike in his chest. Not of anger, but of something colder. Ignore them, he said, more to himself than to Kiri. I am not offended, she replied calmly. Their derogatory terminology is a defense mechanism. They are afraid of the unknown, and I am the most unknown thing on this station. Also, the guard on the left has a hairline fracture in his third rib. He should not be laughing. Soren glanced at her. How do you know that? His breathing pattern is shallow on the left side, and he is favoring his right oblique. The Ulani do not just see, Soren. We perceive the structural integrity of the world around us. The lift opened, and they descended toward the common levels. The mess hall was a cavernous space, filled with the smell of scorched protein and industrial cleaning fluid. It was crowded. Men and women in various Aegis uniforms sat at long metal tables, their voices creating a dull roar of conversation. The room went quiet as Soren and Kiri walked in. It wasn't a total silence, but a localized dip in volume that followed them like a shadow. Soren grabbed a tray and moved toward the serving line. "Hey, Chief!" a voice called out. Soren turned. Sergeant Danny Cho was leaning against a pillar, a smirk playing on his face. Cho was the head of the station's rapid response team, a man who viewed the entire universe as something that could be solved with enough high explosives. "I heard you got assigned a companion," Cho said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Didn't think you'd actually let her through the door." "What's the matter, Vane? Finally realized you couldn't fix the station with just your ego?" Soren looked at Cho. The sergeant was a good soldier, but he was a bored one, which made him dangerous. "She's a researcher, Cho," Soren said, his voice level. "She's here to make sure I don't flatline and take the station's power grid with me. Which, considering how many times I've had to patch your team's sloppy work on the external sensors, is a valid concern." Cho's smirk didn't waver. "A researcher, huh? She looks more like a doll. You sure you didn't just order a custom model from the Inner Rim? I hear the Ulani are real quiet. Real compliant." The air in the room seemed to chill. Soren felt his hand tighten on the edge of his tray. He was about to step forward to say something that would likely end with a formal reprimand when Kiri stepped in front of him. She looked up at Cho, her expression as unreadable as a deep-space nebula. "Sergeant Cho," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the mess hall with a crystalline clarity. "You are currently experiencing an elevated level of testosterone-driven aggression due to a lack of successful combat engagements in the last 42 days. Your attempt to belittle my presence is a primitive display of dominance, designed to mask your own feelings of obsolescence in the face of a non-kinetic threat like the Xylos." The mess hall went completely silent now. Cho blinked, his smirk faltering. "What did you say, you little—" "Furthermore," Kiri continued, unperturbed, "your left boot is half a centimeter lower than your right, which is causing a misalignment in your pelvis. This is why you have a chronic pain in your lower back that you have been hiding from the medical bay. If you continue to posture in this manner, you will likely suffer a disc herniation within the next 3 months. I suggest you sit down and consume more potassium. Your levels are dangerously low." Cho opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around the room, realizing that dozens of people were watching him be dismantled by a girl who barely reached his elbow. He scowled, muttered something about freaks, and pushed past them toward the exit. The tension in the room broke like a fever. People returned to their food, but the glances they cast toward Soren and Kiri were different now. There was a newfound respect, or perhaps just a healthy dose of fear. Soren looked down at Kiri. She was already picking out a piece of fruit from the display. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I did not do it for you," she replied, inspecting the fruit for bruises. "I did it for the data. An agitated sergeant is a variable that interferes with my observations of your behavior. By neutralizing his aggression, I have restored the equilibrium of the environment." "Right," Soren said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "For the data." They ate in silence at a corner table. Soren found that he was actually hungry. He ate the synthetic eggs and the recycled ham with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. Across from him, Kiri ate a single piece of fruit, her eyes constantly scanning the room. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly. She looked up. "Do what?" "The research. The Ulani are an advanced race. You could be doing anything, anywhere in the galaxy. Why come to a rusted-out bucket like Ethelgard to watch a tired engineer try not to die?" Kiri leaned back, her hands folded in her lap. "The Ulani believe that the universe is a song, Soren. Every species, every star, every atom has a note. But sometimes, a note becomes discordant. it loses its way. Humans are the most discordant species we have ever encountered. You are capable of immense beauty and immense destruction, often at the same moment. She paused, her eyes searching his. You, specifically, are a fascinating note. You have spent your entire life fixing things. Pipes, wires, engines. You view your value as a sum of your functions. But you have forgotten why the things you fix are worth saving. I am here to understand the moment a human remembers their purpose. Soren looked away, back toward the crowded mess hall. Purpose is for people with time to think, Kiri. I just have work. She shook her head. Work is function. Purpose is why you do the work, when it no longer makes sense. You stayed on deck 9 last night, even after the alarms stopped. Why? Because someone had to, he said. Exactly, she whispered. They finished their meal and headed back toward the lift. The air felt heavier now, the reality of the task ahead weighing on them. Deck 7, Soren said, as the lift doors closed. That's where the extra mass was logged. 1,200 kilos of equipment that doesn't exist on any manifest. I am already tracking the energy fluctuations in that sector, Kiri said, her eyes beginning to glow with that faint internal light. It is getting louder, Soren. The hum is changing. It is no longer just listening. It is preparing to speak. Soren checked his pulse caster. Stay frosty, Kiri. If Holloway is down there, he's not going to be happy to see us. I am always frosty, she replied, a hint of human sarcasm coloring her tone. I believe that is the correct colloquialism? Soren chuckled. A real, genuine sound this time. Close enough, Kiri. Close enough. Deck 7 was a graveyard of abandoned dreams. It had originally been designed as a secondary laboratory for the Aegis Bioresearch Division, but funding cuts and a shift in corporate priorities had turned it into a high-tech attic. Hundreds of crates were stacked in precarious towers, their contents ranging from obsolete terraforming sensors to crates of dehydrated soil. The air was colder here, the environmental scrubbers running on a low-energy cycle that left a faint, metallic taste on the tongue. Soren moved with a hunter's precision. He had his neural slate out, the screen displaying a heat map of the deck. Most of it was a dull, uniform blue, but near the center of the storage bay, there was a localized spike of orange. There, he whispered, pointing toward a cluster of heavy-duty shipping containers. That's the source. Kiri Val was walking beside him, her small gray bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't looking at the crates. She was looking at the air itself, her eyes tracking patterns of dust and light that Soren couldn't see. The atmospheric particulate count is rising, she noted. Someone has been using a laser welder within the last 3 hours. The scent of ionized argon is quite strong. Soren drew his pulse caster, the hum of the weapon's power cell a comforting vibration against his palm. He signaled for her to stay behind a stack of crates and crept forward. The shipping containers had been arranged to form a makeshift room. A heavy tarp had been draped over the top to muffle any sound or light. Soren reached the edge of the enclosure and paused, his heart rate climbing to 90 beats per minute. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and kicked the tarp aside. "Get your hands up," he shouted. The man inside the enclosure didn't jump. He didn't scream. He simply looked up from the terminal he was working on, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of a non-standard interface. It was Vance Holloway, a senior technician who had been with the Aegis for over 15 years. He was a quiet man, the kind who blended into the background of every briefing, always nodding, never complaining. "Holloway," Soren said, his voice cold, "what the hell are you doing?" Vance sighed, a long, weary sound. He looked like he hadn't slept in a month, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. "I'm saving us, Soren. I'm making sure that when the swarm arrives, They have a reason to keep us alive. He pointed toward the center of the room. Soren's breath hitched. Nestled among the crates was a massive communications array, its architecture a grotesque hybrid of human technology and xylos biology. It looked like a standard transmitter that had been infected by a metallic virus, with dark, pulsating veins of obsidian-like material wrapping around the cooling fans. "You're talking to them," Soren realized, the horror of it sinking in. "You're giving them the station's resonance codes." "They don't want to destroy us," Vance said, his voice trembling with a desperate kind of fervor. "They want to integrate us. They are a collective, Soren. No more loneliness, no more exhaustion, no more fixing things that just break again. We can be part of something that lasts forever." Kirival stepped out from behind the crates, her eyes fixed on the pulsating array. "The Xylos Collective does not integrate," she said, her voice devoid of its usual melodic quality. "It consumes. You are not building a bridge, Vance Holloway. You are building a lure. You are calling the predators to the nest." Vance looked at Kiri, his expression shifting from desperation to a twisted kind of pity. "An Ulani. They sent an Ulani to watch the burner. How poetic. You think you know what peace is? You think your little quiet fields are enough? The swarm is a symphony of billions. Your silence is nothing compared to their song." He reached for a control on his terminal. Soren didn't hesitate. He fired a stun bolt, the blue energy catching Vance in the chest and throwing him back against the crates. The technician slumped to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Soren rushed to the terminal, his fingers flying over the keys. "I have to shut this down. If that signal reaches the Xylos scout ships, we're done." "It is too late for a software shutdown," Kiri said, moving toward the array. "The biological components have already fused with the station's main data trunk. It is no longer an external device. It is an organ." "Can we cut it out?" Soren asked, grabbing his multi-tool. "If you cut it, the feedback loop will shatter the neural links of everyone on this deck," Kiri warned. "Including yours. The Xylos use a high-frequency psychic resonance. It's like a physical hammer to a human brain." "Then what do we do?" Soren demanded. He could see the progress bar on the screen. The signal was at 94% completion. "I must provide a counter-resonance," Kiri said. "I will use my own neural system to dampen the signal." "Wait," Soren said, grabbing her arm. "You told me earlier that would be fatal. You said if I touched the crystals, I'd die." "For a human?" "Yes," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. "But Ulani are built for synchronization. I can hold the frequency for a few seconds, long enough for you to pull the primary power core. But Soren, you must be fast. If I hold it for more than 10 seconds, my neural pathways will begin to crystallize." "No," Soren said, his voice cracking. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," she said softly. "And this is why I am here. This is my purpose." She didn't wait for his consent. She stepped toward the array and placed both of her hands on the pulsating obsidian veins. Her body immediately went rigid. Her nebula eyes flared with a brilliant, blinding light, and a high-pitched hum filled the room, a sound that felt like it was peeling back the layers of Soren's skull. "Kiri!" he screamed. She didn't answer. Her skin was beginning to glow with a faint violet light, the same color as the crystals on Deck 9. Soren didn't waste another second. He dove toward the base of the array, ripping away the protective plating with his bare hands. The edges of the metal were sharp, slicing into his palms, but he didn't feel the pain. He saw the primary power core, a glowing cylinder of pure energy. 3 seconds. He gripped the core and pulled. It didn't budge. The Xylos material had fused with the housing, acting like a biological weld. 5 seconds. Kiri made a sound, a thin, wavering cry of agony that tore through Soren's chest like a serrated blade. He saw her small hands beginning to turn a dull, translucent gray. 7 seconds. Soren planted his boots against the crates and pulled with everything he had. He wasn't just using his muscles, he was using his entire being, his desperation, his anger, and a sudden, terrifying realization that he couldn't let her go. 9 seconds. With a sickening wet sound, the core tore free. The room was instantly plunged into darkness. The high-pitched hum died, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of the storage bay. Soren collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He scrambled toward the array, his hands searching the floor in the dark. Kiri? Kiri? He found her. She was lying on the floor, her body cold and limp. He pulled her into his lap, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold her. "Wake up," he whispered. "Come on, Kiri. Don't do this." He fumbled for his neural slate and turned on the emergency light. She was pale, her skin no longer bronze, but a sickly shade of ash. Her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow he had to press his ear to her chest to hear it. "Chief!" The comm unit on his belt crackled to life. "This is Thorn. We just had a massive power surge on Deck 7. What the hell is going on down there? I need a medical team," Soren shouted into the comm, his voice breaking. "Now! I have a casualty. Ulani, high-frequency neural trauma. Get down here." "Copy that, Vane." Thorn's voice was suddenly grim. "They're on their way." Soren looked down at the girl in his arms. He saw her fingers. They were still gray, the tips hard and crystalline. She had given him those 10 seconds. She had sacrificed her own structural integrity to save a station that viewed her as a curiosity, and a man who had treated her like an intruder. "Why?" he whispered, stroking her hair. "Why would you do that for me?" Her eyelids fluttered, opening just a fraction. The nebula was still there, but it was dim, like a dying star. "Purpose," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It must be sustainable." She drifted back into unconsciousness. Soren sat there in the dark, surrounded by the wreckage of a conspiracy he had barely begun to understand. He looked at his own hands, covered in blood and grease, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a machine. He felt like a man who had been given a gift he didn't deserve. He didn't know if Kiri would survive. He didn't know if the Xylos were still coming. But as he heard the distant sound of the medical team's boots echoing down the hallway, he knew one thing for certain. The function of Soren Vane was over. His purpose had just begun. The medical team arrived 4 minutes later, led by Commander Thorn herself. They worked with a frantic professional speed, loading Kiri onto a gravity stretcher and arresting Vance Halloway. Thorn stood over Soren, her face a mask of concern and authority. "You did good, Harrington," she said, using his military rank for the first time in months. "You saved the station." Soren looked up at her, his eyes hollow and ancient. "I didn't do anything, Commander," he said, his voice flat. "She did. And if she doesn't make it, then there wasn't much worth saving." He stood up, his legs trembling, and followed the stretcher toward the lift. He didn't look back at the array. He didn't look at the prisoner. He only looked at the small gray hand hanging off the side of the stretcher, and he made a silent promise to a girl who had taught him how to sleep. He would not let her note be silenced. Not today. Not ever. As the lift rose toward the medical deck, the station continued its slow, indifferent turn around the gas giant. The stars were still there, immeasurable and cold. But for Soren Vane, the dark no longer felt like a void. It felt like a challenge. He checked his internal clock. It was 842 hours. He had been awake for 4 hours. He felt like he could go for another 1,000, but this time he wouldn't be doing it alone. The medical bay was a sterile hive of activity. Kirival was whisked behind a series of shimmering containment fields, leaving Soren standing in the hallway, his presence no longer required. He didn't leave. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, and watched the technicians work. "What happens now, Chief?" Cho's voice came from behind him. Soren didn't turn around. "Now we wait, Cho. Now we see what kind of universe we're actually living in." Cho stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the medical bay. "I'm sorry about, earlier." Soren glanced at him. The sergeant looked genuinely uncomfortable. "She was right about your back, wasn't she?" Soren asked. Cho sighed. "Yeah, my left disc is screaming. I'm going to go see a medic. Just let me know when she wakes up." "I will," Soren said. As Cho walked away, Soren turned back to the window. Kirival was a small shape in a large machine, but to him she was the only thing that made sense in a sector full of noise. He would find out who Holloway was working for. He would find out how deep the Xylos had buried their seeds. But first, he would wait. Because for the first time in his life, he had somewhere he was supposed to be. And that was a purpose he could finally sustain. The medical observation deck of Outpost Ethelgard was a cold, semicircular mezzanine that overlooked the primary stasis theater. Soren Vane stood at the reinforced glass, his reflection a gaunt, ghostly outline superimposed over the flickering holographic displays below. He had been standing there for 3 hours, ignoring the periodic requests from the medical drones to relocate to a rest cycle. His hands, wrapped in fresh biogauze, gripped the railing with enough force to make the metal groan. Below him, Kirival was a small, motionless figure suspended in a shimmering blue field of pressurized Bacta vapor. The gray crystallization had spread from her fingertips to her forearms, the skin now possessing a translucent, jagged quality that caught the overhead lights like shattered diamonds. The Ulani medics, 4 of them, sent from a nearby diplomatic vessel that had arrived on the double, moved around her with a frantic, silent grace. They weren't using scalpels or lasers. They were using sonic resonators, trying to vibrate the invasive Xylos frequency out of her cellular structure before it reached her central nervous system. "She is stable," a voice said from the shadows of the mezzanine. Soren didn't turn. He knew the heavy, measured tread of Sergeant Danny Cho. The sergeant was no longer wearing his tactical vest, and his left arm was in a sling, but his eyes were sharp, reflecting the neon hum of the medbay. "Stable isn't the same as alive, Cho," Soren said. His voice was a low rumble, worn thin by a lack of water and a surfeit of rage. Cho walked up beside him, leaning his good shoulder against the glass. "The brass wants a full brief, Vane. They're calling it a Level 5 security breach. Intelligence slicks are already crawling all over Deck 7 like roaches on a trash ship. They want to know why a burner and a researcher were the only ones who clocked the signal." Soren finally looked at him. Because everyone else was looking at the manifests. They were looking at what the station was supposed to be doing, not what it was actually doing. Holloway was smart. He used the gaps between the protocols. "He's in the brig," Cho said, his jaw tightening. "Commander Thorne is personally handling the sweep. She sent me to find you. She says if you're not in the interrogation room in 10 minutes, she'll have the security boys carry you there." Soren looked back at Kiri. One of the medics had placed a resonator against her temple, and the resulting vibration made the glass in front of Soren shiver. "Let them try," he muttered. "Vane, look," Cho said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know you're socked in on this girl. I get it. She saved our collective backsides. But Holloway is talking, and he's saying things that are making the commander real twitchy. You need to be in that room. You're the only one who knows the tech he was using. Soren pushed off the railing, the movement stiff and pained. He looked at his bandaged hands. Fine. But if she shifts, if even one of those crystals moves another centimeter, I want a direct feed to my slate. Done, Cho said. The walk to the brig was a blur of fluorescent lights and the distant, echoing clang of security shutters. The station was in a state of hyper-alertness, the ordinary hum of activity replaced by a jagged, nervous energy. Every technician Soren passed looked away, their eyes full of a new kind of suspicion. The wound in the station was deep, and the infection of distrust was spreading faster than the Xylos crystals. The interrogation room was a windowless box of gray alloy on the sub-level of the security hub. It smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Vance Holloway was strapped into a magnetic restraint chair, his face bruised and his jumpsuit torn. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely unrepentant. Commander Ilara Thorne stood in the corner, her arms crossed, her face a mask of iron and exhaustion. "Harrington," she said, her voice like a whip. "Finally." "I'm here, Commander," Soren said, ignoring the use of his rank. Holloway looked up as Soren entered, a thin, bloody smile stretching across his lips. "The burner. I was wondering when you'd show up." "How is the little alien? Still turning into a paperweight?" Soren was across the room in 3 steps. He didn't hit him. He didn't have to. He leaned over Holloway, his face inches from the traitors, and projected a level of cold, focused menace that made even the security guards take a step back. "Tell me about the signal architecture, Vance," Soren said, his voice a deadly silk. "I saw the hybrid tech. That wasn't just Xylos. Someone gave you the Aegis resonance keys. Someone in the inner rim." Vance laughed, a wet, hacking sound. "You think this is just about some credits and a map to the back door? You're so blind, Soren. You spend all your time fixing the pipes that you never ask where the water is coming from." Thorne stepped forward, her boots clicking on the metal floor. "Enough riddles, Holloway. Who is the contact?" "There is no contact," Holloway said, his eyes glazing over with a terrifying fever. "There is only the song. The Xylos don't need keys when the door is already open. Aegis didn't send that Ulani to save you, Soren. They sent her to see if she could survive the integration. You were the control group. You were the bait." Soren felt a cold pit open in his stomach. He looked at Thorne. Her expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a brief, momentary hesitation that told him everything he needed to know. "Commander?" Soren asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't listen to him, Harrington," she said, but the iron in her voice had a hairline fracture. "He's trying to sow discord. It's a standard psychological tactic." "Is it?" Holloway sneered. "Ask her about the secondary directive of the mandate. Ask her why the Ulani are only assigned to the most volatile sectors. It isn't for your health, Soren. It's for the data. Aegis wants to know if they can weaponize the Ulani resonance field. They want to know if they can use it to jam the swarm. And they needed a high-stress environment to test it. They needed a man who was already falling apart." Soren turned away from Holloway and faced Thorne. He felt a different kind of heat now, a slow burning fire that started in his chest and moved through his veins. "Is it true?" he asked. "Was she a field test?" "Harrington, the mission protocol is classified at the highest level for a reason," Thorne said. Her voice regained its strength, but she wouldn't look him in the eye. "We are at war. Every resource must be evaluated. The Ulani volunteered for this." "Did they?" Soren asked. Or did you tell them they were coming here to help us? To save us? The Ulani want peace as much as we do, Thorn said. If their biology provides a solution to the Xylos threat, it is their duty to provide it. Just as it is your duty to maintain this station. My duty, Soren spat. My function. He looked back at Holloway. The technician was watching the exchange with a sick kind of glee. He was a man who had been consumed by the void. A man who had decided that if he couldn't find a purpose, he would at least find a way to end the silence. You're both the same, Soren said, his voice heavy with a sudden crushing clarity. You and Aegis. You both view people as components. You view her as a tool. You view me as a sensor. You think that as long as the machine keeps turning, the cost doesn't matter. He turned toward the door. Where are you going? Thorn demanded. I'm going to do my job, Soren said, not looking back. But not for you, and not for the mandate. He walked out of the brig, his mind racing. He had been a man of function for 34 years. He had fixed the broken, mended the shattered, and ignored the hollow. He had believed that as long as he was useful, he was safe. But Kirival had shown him the lie in that logic. She had shown him that function without purpose was just a slow death. He reached the medical deck and pushed past the guards. He didn't stop until he was at the door of the stasis theater. The Ulani medics looked up, their eyes wide with alarm. You cannot be here, one of them said, stepping into his path. The resonance field is unstable. I don't care about the field, Soren said. He pulled his neural slate from his belt and connected it to the room's main interface. I'm her partner. According to your own protocols, I have a right to be in the room during a synchronization event. That is only for active duty partners, the medic argued. She is in a terminal crystallization phase. There is no synchronization. Then we'll make one, Soren said. He looked through the glass at the small, glass-skinned girl in the Bacta tank. She had saved him from a ghost signal. She had taught him that the universe was a song, even if it was a discordant one. And now, he realized, it was time for him to provide the anchor. He wasn't going to be the bait anymore. He was going to be the reason she came back. The air in the stasis theater was thick with the scent of ozone and the high-frequency whine of the resonators. Soren sat in a medical chair beside Kirival's tank, his head encased in a complex web of neural sensors. He felt the cold prick of the interface needles at the base of his skull, a sensation he had described to many as having 1,000 tiny ice picks driven into his spine. Vane, this is a bad play. Cho's voice crackled in his ear. He was standing on the other side of the observation glass, his face etched with worry. The Ulani medics are saying your brain waves are already at 80% exhaustion. If you bridge with her and she snaps, you're going to get your brains fried like a bad circuit. I've had worse headaches, Cho, Soren muttered. He looked at the monitor. Kiri's heart rate was a flat, rhythmic thrum. Too slow, too steady. She was slipping away into the collective silence of the Ulani deep state. The primary medic, an elder Ulani named Valthar, stepped forward. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his eyes were a deep, sorrowful amber. Soren Vane, he said softly, you must understand. We are not just linking your minds. We are using your consciousness as a gravitational well. You must provide a reason for her note to return to the physical world. If your purpose is not strong enough, you will both drift out into the void. I understand, Soren said. Are you sure? Valthar asked. This is not a technical repair. You cannot fix her with a welder or a wrench. You can only fix her with the truth of who you are. Soren looked at Kiri. He thought about the protein bar wrappers on his desk. He thought about the way she had looked at him at 3 in the morning, like he was a math problem she had already solved but was choosing not to share the answer to. He thought about the 10 seconds she had given him and the way her hand had felt in his, cold, small, and infinitely brave. "I'm sure," he said. Initiating the Cortex Bridge, Balthar announced. The world disappeared. It wasn't like falling asleep. It was like being shattered into 1,000,000 pieces and scattered across the surface of a frozen ocean. For a moment, Soren felt nothing but a terrifying, absolute silence. He was a ghost in a vacuum, a point of consciousness without a body. Then the noise began. It wasn't sound, but thought, a cacophony of billions of voices, screaming in a language of pure mathematics and raw emotion. It was the Xylo's swarm, a tidal wave of static that threatened to dissolve his very being. He felt his memories being pulled apart, his sense of self eroding under the pressure of the collective. "Soren!" a voice cried out. It wasn't Kiri's voice. It was his own, echoing back at him from the dark. He focused. He remembered the smell of the station's recycled air. He remembered the weight of his pulse caster. He remembered the feeling of being tired. Truly, deeply tired. He used the exhaustion as an anchor, a heavy, solid thing that the static couldn't move. He pushed through the noise, moving toward a single, flickering light in the distance. He found her in a place that looked like the surface of a star map. Kirival was standing in the center of a swirling vortex of violet light, her skin entirely gray, her eyes closed. She was fading, her edges blurring into the surrounding nebula. "Kiri!" he shouted. She didn't move. She was trapped in the resonance, her note being pulled into the harmony of the swarm. "Kiri, listen to me," Soren said, stepping toward her. Each step felt like walking through waist-deep lead. "You don't belong here. This isn't your song." "The data," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. "The data says the integration is inevitable. The entropy of the individual is a flaw in the system." "Forget the data," Soren yelled. He reached her and grabbed her shoulders. Her skin felt like cold marble. "Look at me." She opened her eyes, but they were empty, 2 hollow pools of violet light. "Soren, why are you here? You should be sleeping. Your metrics are critical." "Yeah, I'm tired, Kiri. I'm exhausted. My life is a mess of broken pipes and bad coffee. But I'm still here, and I'm still me." "Why?" she asked. "Why endure the friction? Why not join the silence?" "Because the silence doesn't have a point, Kiri," Soren said, his voice cracking with a raw, honest emotion he hadn't felt in years. "I spent my whole life being a machine because I thought it was the only way to survive. I thought that if I did my job, if I was useful, then the darkness wouldn't matter. But you showed me that being useful isn't enough." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "You told me my performance correlates with purpose. Well, this is it. This is the purpose. I'm not here because of a mandate. I'm not here because of Aegis. I'm here because you are my friend. And I don't let my friends turn into glass." The vortex of violet light shivered. The static of the swarm intensified, a roar of frustration that shook the very foundation of the star map. "It is so heavy," Kiri whispered, her gray skin beginning to crack. "Then let me carry some of it," Soren said. He opened his mind. He didn't try to fight the static anymore. He let it in, but he filtered it through his own exhaustion, through the grit and the stubbornness that had kept him alive on Ethelgard for 2 years. He offered her his strength, not the strength of a hero, but the strength of a man who knew how to endure. He felt the crystallization moving into him. He felt his own fingers beginning to stiffen, his own thoughts beginning to slow. But he didn't pull back. He leaned into the connection, pushing his own sense of self into the gaps of her fading consciousness. "Come back, Kiri," he pleaded. "The station is still a mess. I still leave protein bar wrappers on the workstation. I still don't eat my vegetables. Who's going to tell me how bad my metrics are if you're gone?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence and the noise fought a battle over the soul of the Ulani girl. Then he felt a spark, a small, rhythmic pulse that matched the beat of his own heart. 1,234, Kiri whispered. "What?" Soren asked. "That is the number of wrappers I found under your bed," she said, and her eyes suddenly cleared, the nebula returning in a flash of brilliant color. "You are a very messy primary subject." Soren laughed, a sob of relief catching in his throat. "You're damn right I am. Now let's go home." The world exploded into light. Soren woke with a gasp, his lungs burning as if he had been underwater for an hour. He ripped the neural sensors from his head and leaned over the side of the chair, retching. His hands were shaking, and he could see faint, silvery lines tracing the veins in his forearms. Vein. Cho was in the room, his hand on Soren's shoulder. "Steady, man. Steady. You did it." Soren looked at the Bacta tank. The blue vapor was clearing. Kirival was still suspended in the field, but her skin was bronze again. The gray crystals were gone, replaced by faint, shimmering scars that looked like constellations across her arms. She was breathing. "Is she?" Soren rasped. "She is back," Valthar said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended species. "Her note is her own again. But you, Soren Vane, you have changed your own song." Soren looked at his hands. The silvery lines were fading, but the feeling of the connection remained. A quiet, background hum that told him he was no longer alone in the dark. Commander Thorn walked into the room. She looked at Kiri, then at Soren. She opened her mouth to speak, but Soren held up a hand. "Don't," he said. "Harrington, I need a report on the—" "I said don't," Soren repeated, his voice cold and final. "The report will be on your desk at 0800 hours. It will contain the technical details of the breach and the neutralization of the array. It will not contain anything about the Ulani resonance, because as far as Aegis is concerned, the experiment failed." Thorn narrowed her eyes. "You're overstepping, Harrington." "No, I'm setting a new protocol," Soren said, standing up. He felt 100 years old, but his gaze was unshakable. "You wanted a man with a purpose? You got one. And my purpose is ensuring that no one else on this station gets treated like a component, including her. If you have a problem with that, you can file an appeal. I'm sure you know where the forms are." Thorn stared at him for a long time. She looked at the Ulani medics, who were standing in a protective circle around the tank. She looked at Cho, who had his hand on his sidearm, his eyes fixed on the commander. Finally, she nodded. 0800, Harrington. Don't be late." She turned and walked out of the room. Soren collapsed back into the chair, his strength finally failing him. He watched as the medics lowered the stasis field and began the process of reviving Kiri. "You okay, Chief?" Cho asked quietly. "I'm tired, Cho," Soren said. "I'm so incredibly tired." "Go to sleep, Vane. I'll pull the watch." "No," Soren said, watching Kiri's eyes flutter open. "I've had enough sleep for a while. I think I'll just stay here and watch the data." Kiri looked at him through the glass. She didn't say anything, but she did the slow, deliberate blink. Soren smiled. It was the first real smile he had felt in years. The station turned. The gas giant Vespir 4 glowed in the distance. The Xylos were still out there, and the war was far from over. But as Soren Vane sat in the sterile light of the medical bay, he realized that the knot in his chest hadn't just loosened. It had disappeared. He had found his purpose. It wasn't sustainable because it was easy. It was sustainable because it was worth the cost. He leaned his head against the glass and waited for her to wake up. He had a lot of questions about those 1,234 wrappers, and he had a feeling she was going to enjoy giving him the answers. Outside, in the big dark, a single star flared a little brighter. It was probably just a supernova, millions of light-years away. But to Soren, it looked like a sign, a note of beauty in a discordant universe. And for now, that was more than enough. The silence of the medical bay did not last. It was shattered at 0900 hours by a sound that Soren Vane had heard only in his nightmares. The long, low groan of the station's structural lattice twisting under a localized gravitational shear. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of Ethelgard being squeezed by an invisible hand. Soren was on his feet before the first siren tripped. He looked at Kiri Val. She was sitting up on the edge of the recovery plinth, her bronze skin still tracing the faint, silvery lines of the crystallization, her nebula eyes wide with a sudden, sharp clarity. "They are here," she said. Her voice was no longer a whisper, but it carried a strange metallic resonance that made the medical monitors flicker. "They are not singing anymore, Soren. They are screaming." "Vane!" Cho's voice exploded over the comm unit, competing with the sudden roar of the emergency klaxons. "We've got multiple hull breaches on decks 12 through 15. Scanners are blind. It's like the void just grew teeth and started chewing on us." Soren grabbed his tactical vest from the chair, his fingers fumbling with the buckles. He didn't feel the exhaustion anymore. It had been cauterized by a fresh surge of adrenaline. "Stay here, Kiri. The Ulani medics will get you to the escape pods if the atmospheric containment fails." "I cannot stay, Soren," she said, sliding off the plinth. Her legs buckled for a second, but she caught herself against the diagnostic console. "If I stay in a vacuum of information, I am useless. The swarm is using a synchronized harmonic to destabilize the station's integrity. Your engineers will try to weld the plates, but the plates are not the problem. The rhythm is the problem." Soren paused, one arm in his vest. He looked at her, small, fragile, and marked by a sacrifice he still couldn't quite wrap his head around. He thought about Thorne's classified directives, about the way Aegis viewed this girl as a biological jammer. If he took her with him, he was handing her back to the machine. If he left her, she might die in a cold, lonely pod. "Purpose," he whispered to himself. "Sustainable, not consuming." "Grab your bag," he said, his voice dropping into the low, hard register of a man who had made a choice. "We're going to the secondary control hub. If they're using harmonics, I need you on the sensors. But you stay behind me. You hear me? If things go sideways, you bug out. No arguments." Kiri did the slow, deliberate blink, a tiny spark of something. Was it gratitude, flickering in her eyes? "I hear you, Soren Vane." The corridors of Ethelgard were a scene of controlled chaos. Security teams in full vacuum gear were sprinting toward the lower decks, their mag boots clanking like a drumline of war. Soren and Kiri moved against the tide, heading toward the central spindle. The air was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and the bitter tang of fire-suppressant foam. They reached the lift, but the display was dead. "Gravity's failing on the outer ring," Soren muttered, checking his neural slate. "We take the maintenance ladder." It's 6 levels up. It was a grueling climb. Soren went first, his boots finding the rungs with instinctive familiarity, his bandaged hands stinging with every pull. Kiri followed, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the crystallization in her joints clearly causing her pain. He stopped every 10 meters to check on her, his heart hammering against his ribs, not from the exertion, but from the terrifying sight of her struggling. "You okay?" he asked at the 4-level mark. "My structural integrity is at 64%, she panted, her skin glowing with a faint, stressed violet light. "But my resonance is clear. I can feel them, Soren. Thousands of them. They are circling the station like a whirlpool." They reached the secondary control hub on Deck 5. It was a cramped, circular room filled with ancient monitors and manual overrides, a relic of the station's original construction that Soren had kept functional out of sheer stubbornness. He slammed his slate into the console. "Bridge, this is Vane. I'm at Sub-Control 2. Give me a sit-rep." "Vane!" "Thank the stars," Thorne's voice crackled through. "Cho's team is pinned down on Deck 14. We've lost the primary sensor array. We're flying blind in a localized nebula of xylose dust. They're tearing the outer hull apart with some kind of sonic pulse. If we don't stabilize the vibrations, the station is going to shatter in less than 20 minutes. "I'm on it," Soren said. He looked at Kiri, who was already hovering her hands over the haptic sensors of the secondary terminal. She began to move, her fingers dancing in the air, pulling threads of data from the chaos. The screens flickered to life, showing a wireframe model of the station. It was glowing bright red, vibrating with a jagged, irregular frequency. "They are hitting the resonance nodes," Kiri said, her voice turning clinical. "They found the station's natural frequency. It's like a glass shattering from a high note. If we don't shift the phase of the station's internal artificial gravity, the structural failure will be total." "Can you calculate the phase shift?" Soren asked, his hands already diving into the guts of the gravity stabilizer unit under the desk. "I can," she said, "but the station's processors are too slow to keep up with the swarm's adaptations. They are changing the note every 3 seconds. I have to feed the counter-frequency directly into the gravity well." "Directly?" Soren stopped, his multi-tool hovering over a wire. "You mean through your own neural link?" "It is the only way to achieve zero latency," she said, her nebula eyes fixing on his. "No!" Soren snapped. "We just got you back, Kiri. I'm not letting you turn yourself into a fuse again." "Soren," she said, and her voice had that quiet, terrifying certainty. "This is not a sacrifice. This is a function. If the station breaks, everyone dies. If I do this, we have a chance." "A function," Soren repeated, the word tasting like poison. "That's what Thorne thinks. That's what Halloway thinks. I'm not a machine, Kiri, and neither are you. There has to be a way to do this that doesn't involve breaking you." He looked at the gravity well schematics. His mind, sharpened by a lifetime of fixing the unfixable, began to race. He wasn't looking at the wires anymore. He was looking at the song. "The station has 4 primary gravity anchors," he muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "If we don't use a single counter-frequency, but instead create a discordant mesh, a noise floor." "A noise floor?" Kiri asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, like white noise. If we saturate the station's hull with a chaotic, non-repeating vibration, the swarm won't have a stable frequency to lock onto. It's like trying to sing a duet with someone who's just screaming random vowels." Kiri's eyes widened. A chaotic mesh. It would protect the hull, but it would be incredibly taxing on the anchors. They might burn out. "Let them burn!" Soren yelled, as a massive shudder rocked the room, throwing him against the console. "I can replace a gravity anchor. I can't replace you." He looked at her, his face grimed with soot, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "This is what purpose looks like, Kiri. It's not about doing what you were built for. It's about deciding what's worth keeping alive. Kiri looked at the screens, then back at him. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and touched his hand, the one wrapped in bio-gauze. The silver lines on her arm flared once, a warm, steady glow. "I will generate the chaos seed," she said. "You map it to the anchors." Soren nodded. "Let's make some noise." For the next 10 minutes, the secondary control hub became the center of a silent storm. Kirival's mind became a generator of pure mathematical chaos, a stream of non-repeating numbers that she fed into the station's gravity well. Soren, his hands blurred with speed, routed that chaos to the 4 anchors, pushing the machinery to its absolute limit. The station began to hum. It wasn't the rhythmic, haunting sound of the xylos. It was a rough, grinding vibration that made the teeth ache and the vision blur. It was the sound of 1,000 glass jars being filled with gravel. On the wireframe model, the jagged red lines began to smooth out. The structural failure warnings faded from scarlet to orange, then to a dull, cautious yellow. "It's working!" Thorne's voice came through, sounding breathless. "The structural stress is dropping. The swarm is pulling back. They're confused. They can't find the lock." Soren didn't cheer. He was watching the temperature gauges on the anchors. Anchor 3 was at 900 degrees Celsius. Anchor 1 was smoking. "Hold it, Kiri," he whispered. "Just a little longer." "I am holding," she gasped. Her skin was turning a deep, bruised purple, her eyes squeezed shut. The effort of maintaining pure chaos was clearly agonizing for a species that lived for harmony. Suddenly, the station rocked with a different kind of impact. Not a sonic pulse, but a physical one. "Breach!" Cho yelled. "Deck 5! Right outside your door, Vane! They're inside!" Soren spun around, drawing his pulse caster. "Kiri, don't stop! Whatever happens, keep the seed running." The door to the control hub didn't open. It was melted. A stream of superheated plasma cut through the alloy like a hot knife through butter. Through the gap, a Xylos drone pushed its way in. It was a terrifying fusion of obsidian-like chitin and glowing fiber optics, a multi-limbed nightmare that moved with a twitchy insectoid grace. Soren fired. The stun bolt hit the drone's shoulder, splashing against its armor with a shower of blue sparks. It didn't stop. It raised a crystalline limb, the tip glowing with a lethal violet light. Soren dove over the console, tackling the drone. He was a man, 34 years old, exhausted and wounded, fighting a biomechanical predator from the deep dark. By every metric of function, he should have lost. He was slower, weaker, and less efficient. But he had a purpose. He jammed his multi-tool into a joint in the drone's armor, twisting it with every ounce of strength he possessed. The drone screeched, a sound that tore at his eardrums. It lashed out, a serrated limb catching Soren across the ribs, tearing through his vest and skin. Soren didn't let go. He felt the hot blood soaking into his shirt, but he didn't feel the pain. He felt only the desperate need to keep that thing away from Kirival. He fired his pulsecaster point-blank into the drone's central sensor node. The obsidian head exploded in a spray of violet fluid and shattered glass. The drone slumped to the floor, its limbs twitching in its final death throes. Soren collapsed against the wall, clutching his side. He looked at Kiri. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting at the terminal, her hands glowing with a blinding light, her entire body shaking with the strain of the chaos seed. "Kiri," he rasped. "It's over. You can stop." She didn't hear him. She was too deep in the resonance. Soren dragged himself across the floor. leaving a trail of dark blood on the metal. He reached up and pulled the manual override for the gravity well. The chaos seed died. The grinding hum of the station stopped. Kirival slumped forward, her forehead hitting the console with a dull thud. Soren reached for her, his fingers brushing her shoulder. "Kiri." She turned her head slowly. Her eyes were dull. The nebula faded to a faint gray mist. She looked at the dead drone on the floor, then at the blood on Soren's hands. "You are damaged," she whispered. "I'm fine," he said, a weak laugh bubbling in his chest. "Just a flesh wound. We did it, Kiri. We broke their song." She reached out and touched the wound on his side, her cold fingers sending a shiver through his body. "Why?" she asked, and for the first time, her voice sounded truly human. "Why did you fight it like that? You could have retreated. You could have let the drone have the room." "I told you," he said, his vision beginning to swim. "Sustainable purpose. If I let that thing get to you, then nothing I've fixed in the last 2 years would have mattered." He leaned his head back against the console and closed his eyes. The station was quiet now. The alarms were still ringing, and the lights were still flickering, but the hum of the swarm was gone. They had won, but as he felt the darkness closing in, Soren Vane realized that the victory wasn't in the survival of the station. It was in the fact that he was no longer a machine waiting to break. He was a man who had chosen what was worth saving. And as Kirival's small, cool hand rested against his cheek, he knew that the song of the universe had just changed its tune. The aftermath of the assault was a symphony of wreckage. Ethelgard was no longer a proud outpost. It was a wounded animal, its hull scarred by plasma burns and its internal atmosphere thin and metallic. But the Xylos had withdrawn. The chaotic mesh had worked. The swarm's scout ships had drifted away into the void, unable to find a grip on the station's shifting resonance. Soren Vane sat in a restricted briefing room on Deck 1. He was wrapped in a thermal blanket, his side stitched and bandaged with a high-grade biofoam that tingled with every breath. Across from him sat Commander Thorn. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the last 6 hours. Beside her was a man Soren didn't recognize, a tall, skeletal figure in the pristine white uniform of the Aegis High Command. "This is Admiral Silas Vance," Thorn said, her voice devoid of its usual iron. "He arrived with the relief fleet an hour ago." Soren didn't stand. He didn't even look at the Admiral. He was watching the data feed on his slate, monitoring Kirival's recovery in the med bay. She was stable, but the chaos seed had taken a toll. Her resonance nodes were inflamed, and she had slipped into a deep Ulani trance to repair the damage. "Harrington," the Admiral said, his voice as cold and precise as a surgical laser. "Your report on the chaos mesh is innovative. Using the gravity anchors to create a non-repeating noise floor is a feat of engineering that our tactical analysts are already calling a breakthrough." "It was her idea," Soren said. The Admiral tilted his head. "The Ulani researcher. Yes, her performance was indeed remarkable, which is why the High Command has decided to accelerate the secondary directive of the mandate." Soren felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The fire that had been smoldering in his chest since the interrogation of Holloway flared into a white-hot coal. "What directive?" "The Xylos are not gone, Harrington," Vance said, leaning forward. "They have merely been repelled. They will be back, and next time they will bring a hive ship. Our current weapons are ineffective against their resonance shields. But your partner has proven that an Ulani can disrupt their synchronization." "She isn't a weapon," Soren said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "On the contrary," the Admiral countered, "she is the most effective weapon we have. We are transferring her to the Aegis Research Hub on Velonis Prime. We intend to use her neural architecture as a template for a station-wide pulse shield. With a fleet of Ulani partners, we can create a dead zone that the Xylos cannot penetrate. Soren looked at Thorn. Did you know about this? Thorn wouldn't meet his eyes. It's for the survival of the species, Soren. Thousands of lives are at stake. If we can end the war with a new technology. At what cost? Soren asked, standing up, the blanket sliding from his shoulders. You saw what happened to her today. Maintaining that seed nearly killed her. You want to turn her into a permanent transmitter? You'll burn her out in a week. You'll turn an entire race into a set of living batteries. It is a necessary sacrifice, Vance said, his expression unchanging. The Ulani are an allied species. They understand the nature of duty. They understand harmony, Soren spat. You're talking about slavery. You're talking about taking a person and reducing them to a function. I spent 2 years on this station believing that was all I was. I thought, as long as I kept the air moving and the lights on, I was doing my part. But she showed me that's a lie. He stepped toward the Admiral, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. You want to save the species? Then find a way to do it that doesn't involve destroying the very things that make us worth saving. If we win the war by becoming the same kind of cold, consuming collective as the Xylos, then we've already lost. Harrington, you are a lieutenant in the Aegis service, Vance said, his voice hardening. You are ordered to facilitate the transfer of the Ulani subject to the transport ship departing at 2300 hours. If you interfere, you will be stripped of your rank and charged with high treason. Soren looked at the Admiral, then at Thorn. He saw the same thing in both of them, a desperate, clawing fear. They were so afraid of the dark that they were willing to burn everything beautiful just to see where they were standing. He thought about the card with the confirmation codes. He thought about the hammock in the corner of his room. He thought about the way Kiri Val had looked at him and told him that his purpose correlated with his well-being. I'm a burner, Admiral, Soren said, and for the first time in his life, he felt a strange, terrifying peace. My job is to fix the things that are broken, and right now, this whole system is shattered. He turned and walked out of the room. Vane, Thorn called after him, don't do this! You can't win this fight. I've already won, Soren muttered, as the door hissed shut behind him. He didn't go to his quarters. He went to the med bay. The guards at the door were from the relief fleet, tall, faceless men in gleaming white armor. They stepped into his path. Authorized personnel only, one of them said. I'm the chief engineer, Soren said, pulling his neural slate. I have a priority 1 maintenance check on the medbay's atmospheric scrubbers. Move aside, or the air in there is going to turn into pure nitrogen in 5 minutes. The guards looked at each other, then at the slate. They didn't know Soren. They didn't know that he was lying through his teeth. They only knew that he looked like a man who knew what he was doing. They stepped aside. Soren entered the stasis theater. Kiri Val was still in the trance, her body suspended in a field of amber light. Valthar, the elder medic, was seated nearby, his hands folded in his lap. He looked up as Soren entered. They are coming for her, Soren said. I know, Valthar replied. The Admiral has already informed us of the transfer. We're not going to let it happen, Soren said. Valthar sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. We are a small people, Soren Vane. We do not have ships. We do not have weapons. We only have our resonance. Then use it, Soren said, leaning over Kiri's tank. Wake her up. We're leaving. Leaving? Valthar asked. Where would you go? This is the only station in the sector. I know a place, Soren said. It's an old listening post on the moon of Vespere 4. It was decommissioned 20 years ago, but the atmospheric seals are still good. It's not on any current star map. If we can get there, we can disappear. You would give up your life, Valthar said, your rank, your future. For a single note? Soren looked at Kiri. He saw her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He saw the silvery scars on her arms, the marks of a purpose that had almost consumed her. It's not for a note, Soren said. It's for the song. And I'm tired of being the only one who's out of tune. Valthar looked at Soren for a long time, his amber eyes searching for a flaw in the engineer's resolve. He found none. He nodded slowly and stood up. He placed his hands on the glass of the tank and began to hum, a low, melodic frequency that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the room. Kirival's eyes opened. The nebula was dim, but as she saw Soren standing there, it began to swirl with a sudden, fierce color. "Soren?" she whispered. "Grab your bag, Kiri," he said, reaching into the tank and helping her out. "We've got a transport to catch, but it's not the one the Admiral has in mind." They moved through the shadows of the station, using the maintenance tunnels that Soren knew like the back of his hand. They reached the secondary docking bay, the one used for freight shuttles and repair drones. Soren found a small, battered, long-range scout ship. It was a rugged little craft, built for durability rather than speed. He had spent the last 2 years personally maintaining its engines, a project he had never quite finished. He helped Kiri into the cockpit, his side screaming with every movement. He felt the stitches pulling, the warm blood beginning to seep through the foam. He didn't care. He sat in the pilot's seat and began the pre-flight sequence. "Vane," a voice boomed over the bay's speakers. "This is Sergeant Cho. I know what you're doing. Shut down the engines and step out of the craft. Don't make me do this." Soren grabbed the comm mic. "Cho, look at the sensor data on Deck 7. Look at what Halloway was trying to do. Now look at what the Admiral is planning. You're a soldier, Cho. You're not a battery guard." There was a long silence. Soren watched the hangar doors. He saw a team of security guards sprinting across the floor, their rifles raised. "Cho, please," Soren whispered into the mic. "Give me 10 seconds. That's all she gave me." The hangar doors began to open. Not the emergency locks, but the main flight deck overrides. "Vane," the speakers crackled, and Soren could hear the smirk in Cho's voice. "My sensors are showing a massive energy anomaly in the hangar. I'm going to have to shut down the tracking systems for 10 seconds to recalibrate." "Good luck, you crazy gearhead." Soren slammed the throttle forward. The scout ship roared to life, the engines screaming as they fought the station's remaining gravity. They shot out of the hangar and into the velvet dark of the void. Soren didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the moon of Vespere 4, a small, silver crescent hanging in the distance. He felt the ship vibrating around him, the ancient hull groaning under the pressure. He felt a hand on his shoulder, small, cool, and steady. "Why?" Kiri asked. Soren looked at her. He saw the stars reflected in her nebula eyes, and he saw the man he had become. "Because I finally know how to look at it right," he said. She did the slow, deliberate blink. "Where are we going?" "To a place where we can find a new song," Soren said. "A sustainable one." The scout ship disappeared into the shadow of the gas giant, leaving the wounded station and the cold Admiral far behind. They were fugitives. They were broken. They were alone. But as the silence of the deep space filled the cockpit, Soren Vane realized that for the first time in 34 years, he wasn't just fixing a machine. He was building a life. And that was a purpose that would never burn out. The descent toward the moon of Vespere 4 was not a graceful affair. The scout ship, a battered piece of Aegis history named the Lowlight, shivered and groaned as it bit into the thin, frozen atmosphere. Soren Vane sat in the pilot's chair, his teeth gritted against the jagged vibration that threatened to tear his internal stitches. He had one hand on the flight stick and the other pressed firmly against his side, trying to keep the biofoam from leaking any more of his life onto the deck plating. "Watch the pitch, Soren," Kirival said. She was strapped into the navigator's seat, her nebula eyes fixed on the rapidly approaching silver crater land. She looked better than she had an hour ago, the deep purple bruising on her skin fading to a soft lavender, but her hands were still shaking. The atmospheric density is fluctuating. The gravity well of the gas giant is pulling at our tail. "I've got it," Soren rasped. He kicked the thrusters, feeling the ship buck like a wild animal. "Just need to find the signal. Echo 6 should be in the shadow of the northern ridge." The moon, a desolate rock officially designated as Vespir 4 Alpha, but known to old-timers as Echo 6, was a ghost of the early expansion era. It had been a listening post during the First Contact Wars, abandoned when the Aegis decided that orbital stations were more cost-effective. It was a place designed for silence, for men who wanted to disappear into the background noise of the universe. The low light cleared the ridge, and there it was, a cluster of pressurized domes and skeletal antenna arrays, half buried in the pale, lunar dust. It looked like a graveyard of giants. "Landing in 3, 2, 1. The ship hit the dust with a bone-jarring thud. The engines gave one final defiant scream before dying into a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Soren slumped back in his seat, the adrenaline finally ebbing away, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. He looked out the viewport. The sky was a bruised indigo, dominated by the massive, swirling eye of Vespir 4. It was beautiful in a way that made him feel impossibly small. "We are down," Kirival whispered. She unbuckled her harness and moved toward him, her movements fluid despite her exhaustion. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your heart rate is dropping too fast, Soren. You are entering a state of shock." "I'm fine," he lied, though his vision was beginning to fray at the edges. "Just need to get the life support online. Can't breathe. Lunar dust." "You will sit," she commanded, her voice regaining that melodic authority. "I will handle the environmental seals. I have the schematics from your neural slate." He didn't argue. He watched her move through the small cabin, gathering her bag and a portable power cell. She looked like a shadow against the starlight. For 34 years, Soren had viewed his life as a series of technical problems to be solved. He was the engineer. He was the one who fixed things. But as he watched Kiri cycle the airlock, he realized he was the one who was currently broken, and she was the only reason the machine was still running. It took 2 hours to stabilize the base. The listening post was a time capsule. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and 20-year-old plastic, but the seals held. The primary fusion cell hummed to life under Kiri's touch, casting a dim, orange light across the main operations room. Soren lay on a rusted medical cot, watching the ceiling. Kiri had cleaned his wound, applying a fresh layer of biofoam and a shot of stimulants that made his heart feel like a frantic drum. "Why did he let us go?" Kiri asked, sitting on the floor beside the cot. She was sorting through a stack of old data tapes, her fingers tracing the faded labels. "Cho?" Soren asked. He closed his eyes, seeing the sergeant's face in the dark. "Because Cho is a soldier, not a zealot. He spent 15 years following orders that didn't make sense. I think he just wanted to see what would happen if someone said no." "The Admiral will not stop," she said. "He views me as a solution to a mathematical problem. To him, the war is a ledger, and I am the asset that balances the books." "He can't find us here," Soren said, though he didn't entirely believe it. "The lowlight is running a stealth shroud, and Echo 6 was wiped from the active registries a decade ago. We're ghosts, Kiri. Just ghosts in the attic." "But the station," Kiri whispered. "The people on Ethelgard. If the Xylos return—" "We saved them once," Soren snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. The guilt was a jagged stone in his throat. "We can't be the galaxy's shield, Kiri. Not if the shield has to be made of your bones. I won't allow it." She didn't respond for a long time. She simply reached out and took his hand. Her grip was light, but it felt like an anchor. "You told me once that purpose must be sustainable," she said. "Is this sustainable, Soren? Living in a hole in the dirt, waiting for the dark to find us?" Soren looked at her, at the silver scars on her bronze arms, at the nebula in her eyes that had almost been extinguished for the sake of a strategic advantage. He thought about the 1,234 protein bar wrappers. He thought about the 300 days she had planned for their study. "It's more sustainable than the alternative," he said. Across the sector, back on Outpost Ethelgard, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Sergeant Danny Cho stood in the ruins of the secondary control hub, watching a repair crew weld a new plate over the breach Soren had defended. He felt the weight of the pulse caster at his hip, and he felt the even heavier weight of the secret he was carrying. "Sergeant," a voice said. Cho turned. Commander Ilara Thorne stood behind him. She looked hollowed out, her uniform wrinkled and her eyes bloodshot. She didn't look like a woman who had just repelled an alien invasion. She looked like a woman who had lost her soul in the process. "Report," she said. "The tracking systems are still down, Commander," Cho said, his voice flat. "The energy surge from the hangar doors fried the long-range sensors. We have no way of knowing which direction the scout ship headed. They could be half a sector away by now." Thorne looked at him for a long, silent minute. She wasn't a fool. She knew Cho had been the one on duty. She knew the overrides hadn't been an accident. "The Admiral is calling for a court-martial," she whispered. "He wants heads, Cho. He wants to know how a single engineer and a girl managed to walk out of a high-security hangar under the nose of his best tactical team." "Maybe his best tactical team isn't as good as they think they are," Cho shrugged. "Or maybe they just weren't looking for a man with a reason to leave." Thorne stepped closer, her voice dropping so low it was barely audible over the hiss of the welding torches. "He was a good man, Danny. Soren was the best tech I ever had. He fixed everything. He never complained. He just did the work." "That was the problem, Ilara," Cho said, using her name for the first time in 10 years. "He was fixing the station, but he was breaking himself. We all were. We were so busy being useful that we forgot how to be people. Soren just stopped forgetting first." Thorne looked at the stars through the viewport. "The Admiral is right about one thing. The Xylos will be back. And when they come, we won't have a chaos seed. We won't have a miracle. Then we'll have to find another way," Cho said. "A way that doesn't involve burning our friends to light the room. Because if that's the only way we can survive, then maybe the Xylos aren't the ones who are out of tune." Thorne didn't answer. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. On Echo 6, the sun was beginning to rise over the crater rim. It was a pale, cold light that didn't provide any warmth, but it illuminated the dust-covered machines and the two fugitives sitting in the dark. Soren Vane watched Kirival fall into a light Ulani trance, her skin glowing with a soft, peaceful violet. He felt the pain in his side, the cold in his bones, and the uncertainty of their future. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a machine waiting for the next repair order He felt like a man who had finally found the right note. And as he drifted into a dreamless, voluntary sleep, he knew that the data didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the person sitting next to him, and the fact that for the first time in 34 years, he wasn't alone in the dark. 2 weeks had passed since the lowlight touched down in the silver dust of Echo 6. Time on the moon followed a different rhythm, measured not by shifts or mission briefings, but by the slow rotation of Vesper 4 and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the life support monitors. Soren Vane sat on a crate in the main hangar, his multi-tool in hand. He wasn't fixing the ship today. He was working on a small, portable solar array he had salvaged from the ruins of the listening post. His side still ached when he moved too quickly, but the biofoam had done its work, leaving a jagged silver scar that matched the ones on Kiri's arms. He didn't mind the scar. It was a record of a choice. "You are recalibrating the intake again," Kiri said, appearing from the shadows of the dome. She was wearing a pair of oversized technician's coveralls she had found in a locker, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She looked less like a researcher and more like a part of the station. "The lunar dust is getting into the sensors," Soren said, not looking up. "If I don't adjust the tilt, we'll lose 20% efficiency by midnight." 22%, she corrected, a hint of her old clinical tone returning. But then she smiled, a real, human-adjacent expression that reached her nebula eyes. "But I suspect you are just looking for something to do with your hands. You are uncomfortable with the stillness." Soren paused, the multi-tool hovering over a screw. He looked around the hangar. It was quiet. No sirens, no yelling, no hum of the swarm. Just the faint, rhythmic clicking of the solar array as it tracked the sun. "Maybe," he admitted, "spent 30 years thinking stillness was just a precursor to a breakdown. If the machines weren't humming, it meant something was wrong. And now?" Soren stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Kiri. "Now the machines are quiet, and everything feels right. I don't know how to explain it, Kiri. It's like I've been running a fever for my whole life, and it finally broke." They walked out onto the lunar surface. Their pressurized suits hissed as they stepped through the airlock. They didn't go far, just to the edge of the ridge overlooking the valley of antennae. They sat on a ledge of volcanic rock, their boots kicking up small clouds of silver dust that drifted away in the low gravity. Vesper 4 hung above them, a massive, swirling orb of amber and gold. It was so close, it felt like they could reach out and touch the clouds. "I received a signal this morning," Kiri said softly. Her voice came through the helmet comms with a slight crackle of static. A passive transmission on the Ulani diplomatic frequency. It was from Valthar. Soren felt the old knot in his chest tighten for a split second. "The Admiral?" "No," she said. "The Admiral has been recalled to the Inner Rim. There is a scandal. It seems someone leaked the files on the secondary directive to the Union Press. The public is not pleased with the idea of using allied species as biological batteries." Soren let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He thought of Cho. He thought of Thorn. He wondered which one of them had finally decided to burn the bridge. "And the station?" "Ethelgard is being reinforced," Kiri said. "But not with Ulani. They are installing a new type of automated resonance grid. One based on the chaos mesh you designed. It is not as efficient as a living mind, but it is enough to keep the swarm at bay. They call it the Vane Protocol." Soren snorted. "The Vane Protocol. Sounds like a medical condition." "It is a tribute, Soren," she said, "to the man who remembered that function serves the person, not the other way around." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the slow, majestic turn of the gas giant. Soren felt the vastness of the space around them, the millions of light-years of cold, dark void. But he didn't feel small anymore. He felt significant, not because of his rank or his mission success rate, but because he was a part of a song that was finally in harmony. He looked back at the last 14 days. He remembered the way he had once measured his worth in hours worked and circuits mended. He remembered the man who hadn't slept for 6 days because he was afraid that, if he closed his eyes, the world would stop turning. He realized now that the world didn't need him to keep it turning. It just needed him to be in it. I spent most of my life thinking I was a series of gears and wires held together by a paycheck and a sense of duty that felt more like a prison than a calling. I thought that if I stopped moving, if I stopped fixing, I would simply cease to exist. I was so afraid of being broken that I never realized I was already shattered. I was a machine trying to prove it had a soul by running until its parts melted. But sitting here, in the dirt of a dead moon, with a girl who sees the universe in numbers and songs, I finally get it. The universe isn't a problem to be solved. It's not a manifest to be checked, or a signal to be decoded. It's just this. It's the silence between the heartbeats. It's the choice to stay when you could run, and the courage to be useless for a while so you can figure out what's actually worth doing. I'm not the chief engineer of anything anymore. I'm just a man who knows how to sleep and how to wake up next to a friend. For the first time, the knot in my chest isn't a tangle of wires. It's a heartbeat. And it's not consuming me. It's sustaining me. I'm not a burner anymore. I'm just Soren. And that's the best thing I've ever fixed. Soren turned to Kiri. Her helmet was pressed against his, a silent Ulani gesture of deep connection. "What happens now?" he asked. "We continue the study," she said, her voice full of a quiet, shimmering joy. "We have 286 days left in the primary cycle. I suspect we will find a great deal of interesting data in the way the lunar light affects your cognitive peace." 286 days, Soren repeated. He smiled. "I think I can handle that." He stood up, offering his hand to her. She took it, her small bronze fingers interlaced with his gloved ones. They started back toward the dome, two small figures in the vast silver wilderness. "Kiri?" "Yes, Soren? I think I'm going to throw away those protein bar wrappers today. All 1,234 of them." She laughed, a sound that was pure, crystalline harmony. That would be an excellent start to the new data set. As they reached the airlock, Soren paused. He looked up at the stars one last time. He thought about the people back on the station, the soldiers like Cho, the commanders like Thorn, and all the billions of souls out there trying to find their way through the dark. He wondered if they knew what he knew now. I spent 34 years believing that my only value was what I could do for others, how much I could produce, and how many fires I could put out before I burned out myself. I thought that to be worthy, I had to be a machine. But Kiri taught me that the most important thing we can ever fix is our own sense of purpose. I look at the stars now, and I don't see a map of missions. I see a home. So I have to ask you, have you ever felt like a machine in your own life? Have you ever been so busy being useful that you forgot to be you? What would happen if you finally gave yourself permission to stop fixing everything else and just focused on what makes your own heart beat? Soren stepped into the airlock, and the door hissed shut, sealing out the vacuum and the cold. Inside, the lights were warm, the air was sweet, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have to check the clock. He unlatched his helmet, took a deep breath of the recycled air, and smiled at the girl with the star map eyes. The station kept turning, the stars kept burning, and in a small, forgotten dome on a silver moon, the song finally found its perfect, sustainable end. Soren Vane reached out and clicked off the final emergency light, leaving only the soft, natural glow of the gas giant streaming through the portal. He didn't need the artificial light anymore. He had enough of his own.